Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, December 22nd, 2023. So first thing, I just wanted to remind everybody that we are taking a Christmas break this weekend. So we'll be off Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So I'll be back Tuesday writing and recording. So that means the first episode of this show next week is going to come out on Wednesday. So taking a 4-day weekend. We're still going to update the page at antiwar.com if there's big news stories, which I'm sure there's going to be. But the Viewpoint section and kind of the daily update of the entire page, that's going to start up again on Tuesday next week. And also just a reminder again that it's our fundraiser. As the year is wrapping up, if you could help us out, antiwar.com/donate for that. So anyway, now to get into the news, the first story here is a really horrific one. Over 570,000 people are starving in Gaza. So 1 in 4 Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip, over 570,000 people are starving due to the Israeli siege. And this is based on a report using data from the UN and other aid agencies that was released on Thursday. So this report, published by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, the IPC, said the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has caused catastrophic levels of acute food insecurity across the Gaza Strip. The IPC, they have a 5-phase scale for malnutrition, and the report estimates that the entire population of Gaza is facing phase 3 or higher. So phase 3 is already bad enough as it is. It is defined as households either having food consumption gaps that are reflected by high or above usual acute malnutrition, or are marginally able to meet minimum food needs, but only by depleting essential livelihood assets or through crisis coping strategies. So basically saying food is hard to come by and there is some malnutrition as it is, and that's what they're saying the entire population of Gaza is facing. And it says 1 in 4 households in Gaza are at phase 5, and that means catastrophic famine-like conditions. Phase 5 is defined as, and I'll read the quote from, this is how they define this. Quote, households have an extreme lack of food and or other basic needs even after full employment of coping strategies. Starvation, death, destitution, and extremely critical acute malnutrition levels are evident. For famine classification, the area needs to have extreme critical levels of acute malnutrition and mortality, end quote. So they're saying a quarter of the population is facing famine, is basically what they're saying. And this report comes after Human Rights Watch said that Israel was committing a war crime by using starvation as a weapon of war, a starvation against the civilian population as a weapon of war. Oxfam, another international charity, they said this back in October that Israel was using starvation as a weapon of war, and it was very obvious that they were, because right when this thing started, you had Yoav Gallant, the Israeli defense minister, come out and say they were imposing a complete siege on Gaza, which was already under blockade, but now they were cutting off everything. And he said that they were fighting human animals in the Gaza Strip. And of course, they've been letting aid trucks in since, and that's what the U.S. points to whenever confronted with these horrific things these atrocities that the U.S. is fully supporting in Gaza. They say, oh, well, we've pressured Israel to allow aid trucks in, but then you have all the aid groups in the UN basically saying it's completely insufficient. All the aid efforts and relief efforts have broken down on the ground because of Israel expanding its bombing and ground campaign into southern Gaza. And so this sounds like, based on this report, over 500,000 people are on the brink of starvation. And I keep saying, as this thing continues, we're going to start seeing, we'll probably start seeing soon enough, I think, kind of mass death due to starvation and famine. And in situations like this, when all the smoke clears and the dust settles, it usually turns out that these types of conditions cause more deaths than the bombing. That's the situation in Yemen. I know the war in Yemen, according to the UN death toll, more than half of the people died due to starvation and disease caused by the conditions caused by the war and blockade on Yemen. So, all right. The next one here, no functional hospitals remain in North Gaza. This article is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. The World Health Organization reports that all hospitals in northern Gaza are no longer functional. Only 9 out of the 36 hospitals in Gaza before October 7th that were functioning before October 7th are operational at any level. The WHO assessment was made after UN teams assessed the Al-Ali Arab Hospital and al-Shifa Hospital on Wednesday. WHO Emergency Medical Teams Coordinator Sean Casey described the scene at Ali Arab Hospital as, quote, patients were crying out in pain, but they were also crying out for us to give them water, end quote. They explained that the medical staff had no food, fuel, no water. He continued, quote, it looks more like a hospice now than a hospital, but a hospice implies a level of care that the doctors and nurses are unable to provide. It's pretty unbearable to see somebody with casts on multiple limbs, external fixator on multiple limbs without drinking water and almost no IV fluids available. At the moment, it's a place where people are waiting to die unless we are able to move them to a safer location where they can receive care, end quote. So that's really something. I mean, hospital patients not even having access to water, drinking water. And Israel raided this hospital, the Al-Ali Hospital, on Monday. Most of the medical staff was detained and a tank destroyed a wall. So, there's more of Israel's attack on Gaza's hospitals. And this next story here is from the Washington Post, investigating the assault on Gaza's al-Shifa hospital. So al-Shifa is the largest hospital in Gaza, and it got a lot of attention when Israel raided it. And it was the first hospital that it really put under siege. And now that's become a common thing in this war. And the attacks on other hospitals aren't getting as much attention as this one did. And basically what this article from the Washington Post says is that they examined all the evidence that Israel put forward about its claims that a Hamas command and control center was under the hospital. And they said that the evidence falls short of showing that. Basically, that Israel lied about their reasoning for storming the hospital. So it says the evidence presented by the Israeli government falls short of showing that Hamas had been using the hospital as a command and control center, according to a Washington Post analysis of open source visuals, satellite imagery, and all of the publicly released IDF materials. That raises critical questions, legal and humanitarian experts say, about whether the civilian harm caused by Israel's military operations against the hospital, encircling, besieging, and ultimately raiding the facility and the tunnel beneath it were proportionate to the assessed threat. The Post's analysis shows the rooms connected to the tunnel network discovered by IDF troops showed no immediate evidence of military use by Hamas. None of the 5 hospital buildings identified by Hagari, that's an IDF spokesman, appeared to be connected to the tunnel network. There is no evidence that the tunnels could be accessed from inside hospital wards. And if you remember, hours before IDF troops entered the complex, the Biden administration claimed that they had intelligence that bolstered the Israeli claims. They basically backed the Israeli claims about this hospital before the troops went in. So again, the U.S. is completely complicit in everything that Israel is doing in Gaza, even though they're claiming, they'll tell you that, what's his name, Matt Miller, the State Department spokesman, whenever he's confronted about this stuff, he says, look, we don't want to see attacks on hospitals, but they're supporting a military that is actively attacking hospitals. And before this particular raid, they backed the claim that there was some sort of command center underneath, which turns out to be nonsense. And I remember seeing the evidence that, quote unquote, evidence that Israel showed after raiding the hospital, and it really was not much. All right. So the next one here, war in Gaza is the most dangerous situation for journalists ever seen. This is another article from Kyle, and it says the Committee to Protect Journalists reports that the 10 weeks of war in Gaza has killed more journalists than any other conflict. Over 60 journalists have been killed, many while reporting on the brutal Israeli siege in Gaza. Investigation into some of the attacks have determined that the assault was intentional, that the targeting of journalists was intentional. I know there was the one in South Lebanon, which Kyle mentions here, that they struck a group of journalists who were very clearly journalists, standing in the open with press on their vests and everything, and they were targeted. And that is just a huge death toll. Over 60 journalists killed in this in just over 2 months. All right, so the next one here, the UN delays vote on Gaza resolution yet again. So the UN Security Council again pushed back a vote on a Gaza resolution that was initially scheduled to be brought forward for a vote on Monday. The vote is now scheduled for Friday and was delayed throughout the week due to the threat of a U.S. veto. The U.S. worked to water down the resolution and remove a call for the cessation of hostilities. According to AFP, after negotiators worked on Thursday, the latest draft version of the resolution calls for creating the conditions for a sustainable cessation of hostilities. So it calls for the creating of the conditions. It doesn't call for a ceasefire, doesn't call for a cessation of hostilities. So the U.S. got that taken out of it. And another major sticking point about the resolution, which was put forward by the UAE, was a call to give the UN exclusive control of inspections of humanitarian aid before it enters Gaza. And that's something that the US and Israel rejected. According to the Washington Post, the UN also wanted more flexible language on that issue, and that this new draft that was circulated on Thursday satisfied at least some of the US concerns with that issue. Enough so that the U.S. plans to abstain from voting for the resolution. They're not going to vote for it, but they're not going to veto it. That's the way things stand as of Thursday night, according to these reports. We'll see what happens when there's an actual vote. But again, they stripped the main things from it, the big one being the call for a ceasefire. That's something the U.S. does not want to support. U.S. officials have said they also wanted to include language condemning Hamas and supporting Israel's so-called right to defend itself, but it's unclear if such wording was included in this resolution. And the U.S. has vetoed several resolutions calling for ceasefires at the Security Council so far to give political cover to this Israeli massacre of Palestinians. The U.S. also voted against the ceasefire resolution at the UN General Assembly that received overwhelming support, showing really how the U.S. is isolating itself from the rest of the world. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. has been attacked over 100 times in Iraq and Syria since mid-October. A Pentagon official said Thursday that U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria have come under attack at least 102 times since October 17th, when the attacks started due to U.S. support for the Israeli onslaught on Gaza. The Pentagon official told Military Times that the number includes 47 attacks in Iraq and 55 in Syria, and they involved a mix of one-way attack drones, rockets, mortars, and close-range ballistic missiles. At least 66 U.S. troops have been injured in the attacks so far, including 5 who have been awarded Purple Hearts. U.S. officials say most of the rockets and drones fired at U.S. bases did not reach their intended target. Most of these attacks have been claimed by the Islamic Resistance of Iraq, and this is an umbrella group of Iraqi Shia militias that recently popped up, and it's not clear exactly which militias fall under this umbrella, but the U.S. has launched several rounds of airstrikes against Shia militias. One that they targeted specifically in Iraq was Kateb Hezbollah, and that's one of the main Iran-aligned Shia factions, Shia militias in Iraq. And the latest attack that's been confirmed by the U.S. military took place on Wednesday, so these attacks have continued. U.S. Central Command said that a 122-millimeter rocket was fired at the Ain al-Assad Air Base in western Iraq, causing no casualties or damage. And then I just give a little background on the U.S. military presence in both Iraq and Syria. When it comes to Iraq, back in 2020, Iraq's parliament voted to expel all foreign military forces over the U.S. drone strike in Baghdad that killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, and he was killed alongside Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis, who was the leader of the Popular Mobilization Forces, which is an umbrella group that was formed in 2014 to fight ISIS, and that was a group of mostly Shia militias. These Shia militias now that are firing at the U.S. The U.S. killed their leader. And the U.S. refused to leave after Iraq's parliament voted to get them out, and has basically pressured the government in Baghdad using... The U.S. has a lot of leverage over them. They control their money, basically. Their access to U.S. dollars is controlled by the U.S., controlled by the Federal Reserve. Other types of leverage, basically strong-armed the Iraqi government into letting them stay. And then in Syria, of course, the Syrian government is very opposed to the U.S. occupation of eastern Syria, where there's about 900 U.S. troops. And the U.S. also backs the SDF, which is a Kurdish-led group. So that's how they're able to control so much territory in eastern Iraq. All right, so the next one here, Ben Gvir calls to disband war cabinet if Gaza assault is scaled back. So this article is from The Cradle, and it is about Israeli National Security Minister Itamar Ben Gvir. He called on the 21st of December for the disbanding of the war cabinet in the event that the intensity of the Gaza assault is reduced in the coming weeks. So Ben Gvir, again, he's a very extremist settler, probably the most controversial figure in the I guess Bezalel Smotrich is the other one. It's arguable who's more controversial, but Ben Gvir seemed to get the most attention when he was brought into the Netanyahu government. So he's and his party, the Jewish Power Party, were the only ones in the Israeli cabinet to vote against the hostage deal that led to that week-long truce for the Israeli hostages to be released. So Ben Gvir said, quote, "If anyone intends, God forbid, to halt the IDF before Hamas has been defeated and all the hostages have been returned, he should take into account that Otzma Yehudit will not be with him," end quote. And that's Hebrew for Jewish power. He continued, quote, "The idea of reducing activity in Gaza is a failure of war management by the small war cabinet. It should be dismantled immediately. The time has come to restore the reins to the wider security cabinet," end quote. So the war cabinet was made up after October 7th, and I know it includes the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, but it also includes Benny Gantz, who is not in the Netanyahu government, who's not in the security cabinet. And I guess Ben Gvir is not happy that there's this new war cabinet that's making decisions while the cabinet that he's part of is not as involved. So he's just basically saying if they scale down this war, he's probably going to try to take some measure to put the government in trouble. I'm not sure how much power he has to do that. If his party threatened to leave the government, if it would force a vote or anything, because I think there's like Benny Gantz's party, I'm blanking on the name, might be just willing to fill the role for now during the war. All right, so the next one here, the Senate adjourns until 2024 with no Ukraine deal. The Senate adjourned for the holidays on Wednesday without reaching a deal on Ukraine aid and will not return to Washington until January 8th. The Senate was initially due to break for holiday recess at the end of last week, but Majority Leader Chuck Schumer had senators return on Monday to try and reach a border deal to unlock the massive $111 billion spending package that includes military aid for Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. Republicans want significant changes to asylum and immigration laws to restrict the flow of migrants entering the country before approving the foreign military aid package, which includes over $60 billion to fund the Ukraine war for another year. The White House has indicated that it's willing to support new immigration restrictions, but it's unclear when an agreement will be made. According to The Hill, a group of Senate and White House negotiators have agreed to hold a virtual meeting over Christmas and New Year's break, but no votes will happen until next year. House Speaker Mike Johnson adjourned his chamber last week. Johnson and other Republican leadership have made clear that they will support the foreign military aid package once the Democrats make enough concessions on border policy. but we just don't know when this deal is going to happen. So Democrats are lashing out at Republicans for not approving the aid for Ukraine. Senator Mark Warner of Virginia wrote on X, quote, "You know who is going to have the best Christmas imaginable? Vladimir Putin. Our failure to renew aid to Ukraine is a tremendous gift to him. We must get it done next year," end quote. So the $111 billion bill includes $14 billion in additional military aid for Israel to support the massacre that's going on in Gaza. House Republicans passed a separate bill to give Israel the $14 billion separately from the big package. But that was not taken up by the Senate because I think Chuck Schumer didn't want to vote on that because they want to get the whole thing, and also because it cut the $14 billion from the IRS to give to Israel. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. eyes frozen Russian central bank assets to fund the Ukraine war. So this would be a pretty big deal if it happened. The New York Times reported on Thursday that the Biden administration is quietly signaling its support for seizing more than $300 billion in frozen Russian central bank funds to use to fund Ukraine. So these central bank funds are held in the US, Europe, and Japan, and they were frozen using sanctions implemented after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Again, this is Russian central bank money, over $300 billion. And they're thinking about essentially stealing this money to fund Ukraine, to fund this proxy war in Ukraine. And this would be an unprecedented move, and it would really take this economic war against Russia to another level. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen previously said that seizing the funds without action from Congress is not something that the U.S. could do legally. U.S. officials have also been concerned that doing so could make other countries hesitant to keep funds in dollars or at the New York Federal Reserve Bank. You know, I think it could definitely speed up de-dollarization if the U.S. goes ahead and does this. But as the Biden administration is struggling to get Congress to authorize more funding for the proxy war, it is taking a closer look at the idea of using the Russian funds. According to the New York Times, the U.S. has been discussing the issue in recent weeks with fellow Group of 7 nations and pressed them to come up with a strategy by February 24th, which is the 2-year anniversary of the Russian invasion. President Biden has yet to sign off on the strategy as the details are being worked out. One issue that needs to be settled is whether the funds would go directly to Ukraine or dispersed in another way. G7 officials are also discussing whether the funds should be limited to spending on Ukraine's government and reconstruction or used for military spending as well. And that New York Times report, they quoted some think tank guy who's basically said something like, it's so much money, we can't just let it sit there. You know, these people that want to continue, keep this war going, keep this, unwinnable war going, are just want to fund it any way they can. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. granted access to military bases in Denmark. So the U.S. and Denmark signed a defense cooperation agreement on Thursday that grants the U.S. military access to bases in the Nordic nation and allows the storage of U.S. weapons on Danish soil. So if this story sounds familiar, that's because this is the third deal of its kind that the U.S. signed this month, just this month, with a Nordic country. They signed similar deals with Sweden and Finland earlier this month, and it just goes to show that the empire never sleeps, never rests, always expanding. Denmark, the big difference between Sweden and Finland is that Denmark has been a NATO member since NATO was founded in 1949. It was one of the original 12 members. But Denmark has had a long-standing policy of not allowing foreign militaries to be permanently stationed on its territory. But Denmark is now breaking from that policy. Denmark's prime minister said that this defense cooperation agreement will allow American soldiers to be permanently stationed on Danish soil. Blinken signed the deal with his Danish counterpart in Washington on Thursday, and he said that this will allow the two militaries to coordinate more effectively, to do more training, exercises, and things like that. And so again, the third deal of its kind to be signed in a month. And Finland's really the big one because it has that over 800-mile border with Russia. And one of the bases that the U.S. is allowed access in is a border guard base. I mean, just imagine. You try to put the shoe on the other foot if Russia was establishing a military base at a Canadian border guard base. I mean, it's just, we couldn't even fathom that. All right, so the last story here, the U.S. and China hold high-level military talks. So Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Charles Q. Brown, that's the highest-ranking U.S. military officer, he spoke with his Chinese counterpart, Liu Zhenli, in a video call on Thursday, marking the first high-level military talks between the U.S. and China in over a year. So China halted such communications in August 2022 in response to then House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan. China also declined to hold a meeting earlier this year between Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and former Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu because Li is under U.S. sanctions. So he's been removed from his post, but it's just important to point out that the U.S. refused to lift the sanctions. And I think if they did lift those sanctions, they could have had that meeting, but the U.S. refused. But anyway, the Pentagon said that during the call between Brown and Liu on Thursday, the two leaders, quote, discussed the importance of working together to responsibly manage competition, avoid miscalculations, and maintain open and direct lines of communication. The Chinese Defense Ministry said that Liu called on the U.S. to, quote, earnestly respect China's territorial sovereignty and maritime rights and interests in the South China Sea, end quote. In recent years, the U.S., has, as I've covered a lot, has significantly increased its military presence in the South China Sea and is strongly backing the Philippines in this maritime dispute that it has with China. So this conversation came about a month after President Biden met with Chinese President Xi Jinping, and the two leaders agreed to resume military dialogue. NBC News reported on Wednesday that Xi told Biden during the meeting. So this was a recent report. This just came out this week from NBC News. They have this big report that says Xi told Biden during the meeting that China will eventually reunify with Taiwan, preferably by peaceful means. So that is really just Xi repeating what has been China's position for decades, that they will eventually reunify with Taiwan. But it caused this big stir among China hawks in the U.S., basically, and it was portrayed by most media outlets that covered it as Xi telling Biden that he's going to invade Taiwan. But again, he's repeating what's been the official position that Chinese officials often say publicly is that they seek peaceful reunification with Taiwan, but they do not rule out using force. And according to that report, one thing that Xi told Biden is that we've seen all these predictions from U.S. officials that, China's going to invade by 2025. They're going to invade in 2027. And Xi said that these predictions are wrong because he has not set a time frame for reunification. So just something that got totally spun by the media. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter, our great columnist who recently had some serious health problems, heart problems, and was in the hospital and was actually his wife was told that he might not be getting out of the hospital. So his column is titled, "My Own Brush with Death Has Intensified My Opposition to U.S. Imperialism." So please go read that, and it's great that he's back and that, he survived very serious health issues and that he's going to keep on fighting. The next one, Why You Should Support Antiwar.com by John Mearsheimer. Please go check that out. It's really something to know that Mearsheimer, he says in this, that he reads Antiwar.com every day. One from Thomas Knapp, This Christmas, Remember That War is Hell. One from Kim Robinson, They Always Kill Children. And one from Rami Al-Gelda, I'm a Palestinian Christian in Gaza. I want peace for my homeland and my family. So that's it for the week. I hope everyone who celebrates has a great Christmas. I appreciate, we'll be back before the new year, but just reflecting on this past year, I appreciate all the new listeners and readers and supporters. It's been definitely a horrific year when it comes to wars and everything. And I'll definitely be thinking about the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank as well this Christmas. And, I know in Bethlehem in the West Bank where Jesus was born, they're having a very toned down Christmas celebration just because they don't think it's really appropriate to have these big festivities that they usually have. I saw the nativity scene that they have. It's actually baby Jesus is at one church there at least is in rubble. It's very symbolic of just the times in the Holy Land today. But anyway, again, have a good holiday. I'm going to have a nice long weekend. We have a little Christmas Eve party, and then Christmas Day, of course, is going to be fun with especially my little Dave, who he kind of knows what's going on this year. He's 2, so we have a great present to give him that I think he'll be happy about. So we'll have fun. And then I'll be back next week. Anyway, thanks for listening.